Along with supervisory duties, he also serves as the Board of Director for Southern California Association of Governments, Omnitrans, and the San Bernardino County Associated Governments. Supervisor Hagman earned a Bachelor of Art degree in psychology at UCLA. He and his wife Grace have 2 children. Jonathan, a student at UCLA, and Elizabeth, a student at Oxford Preparatory Academy in Chino. Mr. Hagman's experience in local and state government and as a small business owner has provided him insight into the issues facing the constituencies. Please welcome 4th District Supervisor Kurt Hagman. Thank
you. Appreciate it. Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out for this. Before we start this today, I was able to have a couple conversations, and I remember back in my Workforce Investment Board days, was probably not the 29th annual, it was probably the 22nd annual or something like that, and this has grown more and more, and obviously the services you provide are needed more and more all the time. So thank you for coming out today, and also thank you for dealing with everything that the legislature passes down. I know just dealing on the rules and changes that are constantly happening, and especially this year, you're going to have a lot of them. So not only doing your day-to-day jobs, but also what's going to happen in 2 months, what's going to happen in January, what's going to happen in next March. And we'll all try to work that together, especially on the county level, but there's going to be a lot of changes, and I know it's ever-changing, so thank you for doing that as well. The 29th Annual Children Network Conference is the premier Inland Empire event for over 500 human service professionals to network and learn about improving our ability to help children. San Bernardino County is proud to take the leadership role on behalf of this and our future, and I want to specifically thank our county Children and Family Services, Children Network, First Five of California, our San Bernardino County Behavioral Health, Children's Fund for their leadership in creating this outstanding event and making it better each year. And just be thankful you're indoors because it's still going to be warm outside for the rest of the day, so enjoy the air conditioning here. The 44 workshops and 2 outstanding keynote speakers in this year's conference will no doubt provide diverse opportunities for you and your organizations like yours to become more effective and advocate for high-risk kids, at-risk kids. Those who are here actively involved in building skills that will change their lives for the better, and I can't think of no higher calling than serving our children and providing a better and brighter future for them to grow in. From birth to the rest of their child development, the county strives to provide consistent support throughout all stages of life. Outreach and education for children and their families is the first step in ensuring future success. The goal of San Bernardino County is to be proactive, concentrating on raising awareness of various issues so that problems can be prevented and the children are protected. The county must draw upon both public and private interests, and while everyone's a stakeholder when it comes to our region's youth. Community involvement is key in ensuring success, and we create an environment that provides much-needed social support networks for our children and our families to thrive. Efforts to help children, youth, families must draw from diverse fields, involvement from public officials, our teachers, medical professionals, parents, and many others is necessary to create the most comprehensive system of support. Collaboration between existing agencies like yourself will also increase the efficiency in terms of both administration and the actual providing of the services. On behalf of San Bernardino County, I want to thank you for your dedication and hard work on behalf of our smallest residents and those who need your skills and advocacy on their behalf the most. And the Board of Supervisors make human services a priority, and we look forward to receiving the full report of this conference when it's all done. So thank you so much for coming. Please have a wonderful day. I know we have a great speaker next, and thank you for coming to the 4th District. And pretty soon we'll have our airport working for you, even better for you. So thanks. Bye-bye.
Let me tell you a few things about our keynote speaker this morning. I've heard about Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti's work for years, especially when I was the SART Screening Assessment Referral and Treatment Coordinator for San Bernardino County. It was eye-opening, and I know we've shared it with many of you folks in many different versions, or not versions, but different regions throughout the county. There's been presentations on it, and I think we're really excited this morning to hear from the man who helped develop it and to carry it through and to see what next steps are. We know what the intervention, we know what the prevention should be, but what can we do to intervene with these kids and these folks that have been through so much as children? So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Anda. I don't know where where are you going, Dr. Anda? Bye-bye. In the early 1990s, Rob began a collaboration with Dr. Vincent Folletti at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego to investigate child abuse as an underlying cause of medical, social, and public health problems. This effort led to a large-scale study funded by the CDC to track the effects of childhood trauma on health throughout the lifespan. They called it the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Rob played the principal role in the design of the study and serves as its co-principal investigator. Findings from the ACE study have been presented at congressional briefings and numerous conferences around the world. The ACE study is being replicated in numerous countries by the World Health Organization and is in use to assess the childhood origins of health and social problems in more than 18 U.S. states. Dr. Anda is the author of more than 20 publications, including numerous government publications and book chapters, and has received numerous awards and recognition for scientific achievements. He has appeared in national newspapers and television networks and is frequently invited to speak about the ACE study and his experience around the country working on applications of ACE study concepts. Dr. Anda now works in his role as co-founder of ACE Interface to deliver training materials at the state and community levels about neurobiology, epigenetics, ACEs, resilience, and community capacity development. His dream is to help create a trauma-informed nation. Please welcome Dr. Robert Anda.
Is my mic on? You can hear me, right? Because I'm hard of hearing and I wouldn't know. First of all, I want to thank you all for the work that you do. I know that you work many times in very difficult conditions, and you see a lot of hard things that are difficult to deal with. And my job primarily is to go out and teach about the effects of adversity and stress and trauma on the lives of children and families, and to help this nation know that what I believe, which is the kind of work that you do, is you're addressing the number one public health problem in our country and the number one public health problem around the world. So since I can't see the slides, I am going to move down. I hope you can see me. And we have a clicker here. I'm going to talk about what I call building self-healing communities. And you might think that I'm hopelessly utopian in talking about self-healing communities, but I'm here to tell you that I'm watching them being built around the country. And at the end of my presentation, I'm going to give you an example of what I believe is proof that self-healing communities exist. And it's also in this title of this is the progressive nature of adverse childhood experiences. We're going to talk about how adversity affects the lives of people throughout their whole life course, how it affects children and the people that interact with them. And the way that we're going to reach success in this field is by halting the progression, by keeping the adversity. There's already a lot of adversity out there, but we want throughout the life course to keep that adversity from progressing in the lives of children and families. This is my model, and forgive the engineering thing with all the gears. I didn't know how to do it any better, about what a self-healing community looks like. See all the gears and the way they interact and the belt? We want to get those gears spinning. And in our country, those gears, number one, they don't spin very fast in terms of my belief is it successfully, and the gears don't intermesh very much. So we want to get those gears interacting together across systems, and we want to get things moving more quickly so the change will happen more rapidly, and you can get the kind of help that you need to support children and families. What's the biggest gear? People affected by adversity and trauma and stress. The reason that I put that there is because if you look at the data, the surveys on adversity, there are more people affected by adversity and have consequences related to adversity than people who have not experienced adversity been affected by them. So it's the majority of our population needs to be engaged in these self-healing communities, and they are going to be the primary power for change. And once they are informed about this information, and simultaneously the systems they interact with are informed with this information, I believe that things will begin to move faster, and we will have self-healing communities. This is my favorite photograph. It's called The Walk to Paradise Garden. And just very briefly, what I see in this, I'm not sure what you see or what you feel when you look at it, but I see the beauty of childhood, and I feel hopeful. And I want you to walk away hopeful this morning from this presentation, even though we're looking at all the many effects of adverse childhood experiences on health and social well-being. I saw this photograph first before I got engaged in this kind of research, and now when I look at the photograph, you see the hopeful future and the children walking into a garden, but behind them it's kind of shadowy. And I learned by doing this research that I didn't know how much adversity and trauma and abuse and neglect and violence there was in the lives of children and families. And what I needed to learn how to do is I needed to hold that information, even though it's difficult to look at how much adversity there is, and remain hopeful. And I want you to remain hopeful too, because what we're going to see today is that adversity has highly predictable outcomes, which means that as we prevent it, that the health of our society can change dramatically. So I'm going to talk about hope, biology of hope. In this graphic on the left, the height of these bars are the chances of dying from heart disease in a national study of 12,000 people that were followed for more than 12 years. So the height of the bars is the risk of dying from heart disease. Across the bottom, if you see the labels, is the amount of hopelessness they felt in their lives, from none to a little bit to quite a bit, and if you go to the far right, to the point where people are so hopeful that they felt like giving up. This question was asked at the beginning of that survey. And what we saw is that as people lost hope in their lives, they were more likely to die from heart disease. And we don't know actually how that biology works. But this is an example of how important hope is, not only biologically, but the way we feel and the way we act and the way we move forward. So there is an underlying effect of the biology of hope on the functioning of the human heart. I'm going to tell you a quick story, and it's a fish story, and it's a parenting story, because I was not trained to be a parent. I learned on the fly. This was taken about 15 years ago outside a little lake where I live in south of Atlanta, and after work I would go fishing in my canoe. And one night I was coming in, I hadn't caught anything, and I was dragging a lure. I was coming up to the dock, and I had my pole between my legs, and I was ready to get out of the canoe, and my pole almost flew out of the canoe. And I'm pulling in, and there's this really heavy thing at the end of the line. And as I got this thing up next to the canoe, because it was dark, I saw this, look down in the water, I see this dark black thing. I thought I'd caught a turtle. Turns out I'd caught this largemouth bass, this really big trophy largemouth bass, and the top of their heads has some black coloring on it. And I got it out, and there was nobody there. I didn't have a scale. I didn't have a tape measure. So I called a friend and said, nobody's going to believe I caught this fish. Okay, and it's going to be a fish story. So he woke up my son, and that's my son Will here with his little Spidey Man pajamas on. And he was delighted. I get a chance to go out to the lake. It's nighttime. I get to be at the lake, and my dad's caught this big fish. And so I used Will as a vertical scale, okay, to say, well, here's how big that fish was. And here was my brilliant parenting idea. I said, I looked, how big around is Will's head? And how big around is the mouth of the fish? And I actually did this. I said, Will, turn your head sideways, and I'm going to put your head inside the mouth of the fish. And his look of joy turned to abject terror in the dark of night by the lake. Okay? And the real irony of this, you can't see it, but I'm wearing a Prevent Child Abuse t-shirt while I'm doing this. So my point in telling you that is about parenting, and there's many people here who work with parents. It's harder for parents who've experienced a lot of stress and adversity through parenting. And I'm going to emphasize today the fact that we need to work with both generations and help people who've been affected by trauma and stress to parent better so that they don't pass their adversity on to the next generation. So, 15 years later, we're talking about hope, all right? I'm sorry, we want to be hopeful here. 15 years later, here's Will in Alaska. I took him on a trip. He caught a 100-pound halibut. And he didn't ask me to do anything funny with that fish. He didn't ask me to put my head inside of his 100-pound halibut. So I think in my family, the cycle of these strange things with fish has been broken. Can you advance this slide for me? This doesn't seem to be working. There's hope. Okay. So we have the biology of hope, and we're going to talk about the biology of adversity. It's important to understand these basic concepts. When I talk about the biology of adversity, I'm talking about the biology of stress. It's a word we all use, but this is an evolutionary thing that we have called fight or flight, which you've all heard of. And the chemistry of fight or flight is what leads to the many health and social outcomes that we see that are related to adversity. That chemistry involves adrenaline. You've all heard of adrenaline. What that does is when we're in a difficult situation, it raises our heart rate, our blood pressures. We actually get stronger so that we can respond immediately to threat. And the second thing that's released, you'll see, is cortisol, which is a steroid hormone released from our adrenal glands, which lay on top of our kidneys. Adrenaline is a neurotransmitter. Our nerve cells communicate one to another, and there's a gap between the nerve cells, and so there are chemicals that are released from one cell to another that tell the next cell to respond. That's how they talk to each other. Adrenaline is one of those chemicals. Cortisol, the steroid hormone cortisol, if it's released repeatedly or in high doses, is toxic to developing brain cells. It makes it difficult for them to make connections. So we imagine developing neural networks in the brain of a child being flooded with these two things, the adrenaline confusing the talking between the cells, and the cortisol making it difficult for those cells to make healthy connections. And in really high doses, cortisol kills nerve cells. So sometimes you'll see in extreme examples, the size of brains of children who are under a lot of stress is actually smaller than the size of the brains of children who haven't had a lot of stress. And it's because of this chemistry. So if it's unpredictable or severe, the stress, if it's unpredictable or severe, it leads to vulnerability. And this is the biology that we're talking about today. It's a biologic process. And if there's many episodes or it's chronic over time, day after week, the grind of year after year, month after month, exposure to stress and chaos, or if there's really high stress levels, there's more vulnerability. This is interesting, reading these backwards from the screen here. But if it's predictable or moderate, it leads to our ability to hit a speed bump in life, a stress speed bump in life, and calm ourselves down. And calm ourselves down so that chemistry doesn't stay high. And people who are on the vulnerable side tend to have difficulty doing that, calming themselves down, so their levels of adrenaline and cortisol tend to be chronically higher. And one of the things that we want to do in terms of halting progression is to help provide things that help them to feel safe and to help them calm down so that this biology doesn't progress throughout their life, from childhood all the way to age 90. I like to use this piece of art that I first saw somewhere around 1990 from a newspaper, American Medical Association newspaper that went to all physicians. It was the first time that association tried to teach physicians that domestic violence might have something to do with health. Okay? It was the first awakening of trying to teach physicians and healthcare providers about that. So what I want you to just briefly look at, this is a snapshot of what we're talking about today. We have two parents putting their child in a high-stress fight-or-flight mode. So the adrenaline and cortisol levels are high in that child's blood and in that child's brain. which potentially but not necessarily are going to take that child down a life course pathway that can lead to more adversity and some of the health and social outcomes that we're all here to try to prevent. And it took me about 5 or 6 years of showing this piece of art to change the way I felt and the way I thought about those two parents. I don't know what you look at them. What do you think and feel when you see them? I was sort of outraged. Now what I do is I feel compassion. Because I say, what was their house like? What was their community like? What were they exposed to when they were growing up? They're having difficulty regulating their emotions. They're having difficulty tuning into their child. And this is what I'm talking about, the intergenerational transmission of adversity and stress and trauma, that we're here to help parents like that so that they stress their child less. Okay, on the far left here, this left frame, thank you. That's easier looking down than down. On the far left frame is a sketch of brain cells. There's about a dozen of them. At birth, we are born largely unwired. We're not computers. We're adaptive creatures, and our brains adapt to the experience that comes in from all of our senses and get us ready for whatever it is that's happening in the outside world. So at birth, we're born largely unwired, and there's not many connections between those cells at the beginning at birth. In the middle frame, at age 6, you see hundreds or thousands of connections between those same cells. Those connections are the result of experience. The nerve cells learn from what comes in, and they make connections that will respond to the type of environment that we live in. So experience, whether it's stressful experiences or loving, nurturing experiences, determine the way we wire up and adapt to what we're going to experience in life. On the far right, you see there are fewer connections at age 14 than there are at age 6. There's a process at the time of puberty called pruning, wherein the least experienced neural networks tend to withdraw. So there's this opportunity to connect and respond. This is probably the reason why neglect, not getting the input and experience we need in the parts of the brain that can learn, not getting that means that it will be difficult to have those kind of functions after about age 14. It doesn't mean we can't do something about it, but the ability to learn. So this is probably why neglect is so powerful. This is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, and it's called Persistent Stress Changes Brain Architecture. On the top left, see the beautiful, healthy, this is one nerve cell, brain cell. It's like a Christmas tree. It's got lots of colors, and it's branching out. It's ready to make connections and healthy network with another cell. Below it, circled, you see a cell that has been exposed to a lot of stress, the chemistry of stress that we just talked about. It's been overwhelmed. It's been overwhelmed by the cortisol, and it's damaged. It has less ability to connect. On the upper right, if you take a little section of that cell and put it under a microscope, on the upper right, see all the little lumpy, bumpy things on that little piece of the cell? That's where that cell has an ability to reach out and make healthy connections. And as you go down and look below, the damaged cell only has about half of the ability to communicate with nerve cells next to it. Who here has heard of epigenetics? Oh, good. Okay, so not very many people. I'm learning too. This is a new field, and it's kind of difficult. So I'm going to give you a primer. We've talked about how stress and adversity influence the way the brain grows and develops. What epigenetics tells us, I'm going to move down. This slide. You can see, I'm going to look over here. See the human chromosome down at the bottom? We have our DNA. Our DNA has to be really well organized, tightly well organized to be healthy. And if you think of the fishing line analogy, I was fishing, if we have this really, really long, many thousands of yards of fishing line, and it wasn't on a reel, and you tried to do something organized with it, what would happen? It'd be all tangled, it'd be a mess. You couldn't do anything. Well, our DNA is this incredibly long strand of coding information that tells cells what to do. So it has to be really well organized in order to function well. So at the bottom of this, you see chromosomes, and as you move up, you see the little round balls. The little round balls, and they see that they become yellow with the blue strand around them. Those yellow balls are proteins that our DNA is wrapped around. The blue part is the DNA wrapped around the little balls. And then you see the 6 big ones. They're called histones, where the DNA is still wrapped around the ball. It's not ready to be opened up to be available to the cell. And then you see the little orange cylinders. See those? Those little orange cylinders are chemicals that attach to the DNA. They attach to the DNA. Experience can determine when and how often those chemicals attach to the DNA. In order for, as you go to the very top where you see the gene, at the very top of the slide, in order for the DNA to unfold and be open, and the code on the gene that tells the cell what to do, you might tell the cell to make insulin or to get ready to make another cell or to do some kind of function. The code on the gene is not available unless that chemical attachment is released. Experience, this is really powerful when we start to think about the biology of the kind of things that you deal with. Our experience determines when those little orange chemicals attach to DNA or not. So our experience actually modulates which genes are available to be read and which are not, and when. So we have the chromosome. That's called, this is epigenetics, is above or around the genome, the things that happen that control the availability of genes to be read. And why is that important? Because now researchers in this field are mapping in people who have had a lot of adversity versus those that have not. They have mapping of which genes are open and which genes are closed. Those maps look different. So adversity can relate to what genes are available to be read, and the patterns that they're finding are patterns that are related to the risk for some of the diseases that are the outcomes, things like heart disease and risk for cancer, and probably things like mental illness and substance abuse. Although we've not proven that yet, my belief is that many of the powerful relationships between adversity and outcomes are modulated by this process of the fluctuation in which genes can be read and which genes are closed up. So people talk about how our experiences get embodied, how stress gets into our bodies. Memory of our experiences is stored in our bodies through neuroscience and probably through the epigenetic mechanisms. Okay, this is the ACE pyramid. The way that I want you to think about this, if you look at the arrow on the left, it starts at conception, and it's a life course model as you go up from the bottom to the top, where the months and the days and the weeks and the years pile up through life to the time of death, which faces us all. I want you to imagine that arrow going up through the pyramid. The reason we did the ACE study is if you look at, say, the top 3 segments of this pyramid. The reason Vincent Folletti and I did this work is because our society tends to respond to the top part of this pyramid and then we wait. We wait until there are health risk behaviors in place. We wait until there are impairments in social functioning and the way we think and the way we manage emotions that lead to disease, disability, and social problems. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to find out about the very primary things. What are the primary things that generate all that risk? And that's the essence of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And we didn't know, I'm going to show you some really powerful information. We didn't know how powerful this information was going to be. We were kind of guessing. You were saying, let's look at adverse childhood experiences and see if they lead people up the pyramid. So we've looked at the epigenetic mechanisms and also in the second tier, the neuroscience of how this works. And don't forget what I'm talking about, which I think sometimes we forget in our society. We have to work with both generations simultaneously. We work with the children and we work with the people who have experienced adversity, which is the majority of the population, to prevent the intergenerational cycle of the transmission of adverse childhood experiences. So the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, examines the health and social effects of adversity throughout the lifespan among more than 17,000 people of the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego County. It was done in a primary care setting. These people were healthy people. They were coming for preventive care. They're well-educated people. Most had been to college, only 6% didn't have a high school diploma. It's a predominantly middle class, upper middle class community, and it's also predominantly white. I want you to think about that for a minute. This is, in a way, the best case scenario. It would be hard to assemble 17,000 healthier people in this country than the 17,000 that we assembled in the ACE study. So if you think about what the effects of adversity might look like in other settings where people don't have these kind of advantages, this is sort of the best case scenario. And we were actually surprised because some people, when we did the study, said, why are you studying those people? Everything must be just the way you want it to be. And it's not true. Adversity is everywhere. It doesn't recognize social class. It doesn't recognize the color of our skin. It's worse in some communities than others, but it's everywhere, and that's what we found in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego. Adverse childhood experiences are common. It's the first thing that we learned. I didn't know that because I was a cardiovascular disease researcher at the Centers for Disease Control. So I learned by doing this, and I was shocked to see just how common these things were. The first group we called household dysfunction. There are going to be 10 adversities. This first group of 5, 27% of these people grew up with substance abusing people in their house. Almost 1 in 4 with the stress. We're talking about relational stress that occurs where there's separation or divorce. 17% with mentally ill caregivers. 13% witnessed their mothers being physically abused, and 6% had a household member sent to prison. 11% had been psychologically abused. 28% had been physically abused, and 1 in 5 had been sexually abused during their childhood. And then we also looked at neglect. That is not getting the input you need to wire up to have those kind of functions that come along with that input. 15% were emotionally neglected, and 10% had been physically neglected. So ACEs were common. I didn't know that. I was the first person to see this data, and this was in 1995. I was the first person to see the data, and I wept. I had no idea. I'd not been trained to think about that. And one of the things that we need to do, all of us, is we need to tell people who don't want to see this and don't want to look into the dark part of this, to teach them how common this is, and then to teach them all of the ways that this flows out into society that create the kind of problems that we tend to spend a lot of money on at the top of the ACE pyramid, where things can be effective, but usually are relatively ineffective and expensive. Next thing we found is because we'd looked at 10 different types of adversity, and this was new at the time. Most people had looked at single types of adversity like sexual abuse or physical abuse, is that the ACEs rarely occur in isolation, where there's one in a family or a household environment. There's usually multiple adversities. So let me walk you through that. If you were one of the 17,000 people in our study that filled out our questionnaire, and you told us that you grew up in a household where there was substance abuse, your chance as a percentage, if you see the yellow line there, your chance as a percentage of having one of those other 10 ACEs is 81%. So you've got the first stressor, which is the substance abuse in the house that creates a lot of chaos and and stress. You have 80% chance of having one other, and if you go to the far right, your chance of having 4 or more of those 10 categories of adversity is almost 60%. So think about the piling up. If you grow up with substance abuse, that's one stressor. 60% of you would have 4 or more, so you add those up, that's 5. 60% of you would have 5 or more adverse childhood experiences in your background. So the way we dealt with that is we created what we called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Score. And it was a simple way of dealing with the complexity of how all these adversities tend to co-occur in the lives of families and children. Each adversity counted 1 point. There were 10 of them, so the score ranged from 0 to 10. We treated them all the same. They all counted 1 point. And we've talked about the biology of stress. I now think of this ACE score as a measure of the cumulative dose. How much chemistry and biology of stress were these people exposed to during their childhoods? That's what the ACE score means to me. Only 1 in 3 people, 33%, had an ACE score of 0. That was another shocker to me in this population. 26% had 1, and if you go to the bottom, 4 or more, 16% of people, of these healthy people in the Kaiser Health Plan, had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences in their background. So now we're going to go, ACEs are common, they're highly interrelated, and you can create a score, an ACE score that is a measure of the cumulative stress dose of childhood. We're going to look at how that score relates to really important health and social outcomes. This graph is across the bottom. You see the numbers 0 through 5 or more. That's the ACE score, the stress dose. The height of these bars is the percentage of people, of those 17,000 people that started using drugs. We asked them, did you ever use street drugs, and how old were you when you started using them? This is starting at by age 14. So at an ACE score of 0, it's about 1%. And as you go across, you see this goes up stepwise like a staircase. More and more stress, more and more people starting drug use early. That's what we call dose response. The higher the childhood stress dose, the higher the likelihood of the kind of negative outcomes that we don't like in our society. And you go to the far right at 5 or more, it's 10%. So if you take the height of that bar, that 10% bar, for 5 or more, and take the ratio of the height of that bar to the 0 bar, people with ACE scores of 5 or more are 10 times more likely to begin using street drugs by age 14. Go back. Okay, and then the next slide. Teen pregnancy. Here's teen pregnancy. We ask women about their reproductive histories. This is women telling us that they had at least 1 pregnancy as a teenager during their life, at least 1. And as you go from ACE score 0 on the far left to 7 or 8 on the far right, you see this dose response band, higher chances of having teen pregnancies, and it's about 50% of women with ACE scores 7, 8, or higher have had a teen pregnancy. Addiction. Here we have, this looks like the early initiation slide. You can almost lay them on top of each other. They look the same. This is the probability of being addicted to drugs, prescription drugs or street drugs, as an adult. It's less than 1% for an ACE score of 0, with really rapid increase in risk, such that age 8 score 5 or more, it's almost 10%. So the risk of addiction, drug addiction, is increased tenfold as you go across this. But even in the middle, like look at the ACE score 3 bar. Those people are 4 times more likely to be addicted than people with ACE scores of 0. Addiction is really uncommon in people that don't grow up with a lot of stress in their lives. That's another way of looking at it. So as we reduce stress, addiction will become less common in our culture. Here's alcoholism. This cluster of bars on the left is the percentage of people who said they're alcoholics. And the color code, the green one is 0, and then 1, 2, 3, or 4 more ACEs. People with 4 or more ACEs are 6 times more likely to tell us that they're alcoholics. We're interested in relationships because relationships determine what the household looks like and how children experience their lives. The probability of growing up and marrying an alcoholic, or not shown here, marrying somebody who's addicted to drugs, goes up in a stepwise dose-response fashion as the childhood experience dose goes up. Mental health. Let's take a look at mental health. What's the greatest cause of disability in the United States? And I'm giving you a hint. It's a hint here. What's the leading cause of disability in developed countries? It's depression. We see the same pattern. This is becoming really familiar now, right? In the pink bars is the data for women. About 15% with a score of 0 have a lifetime history of depression. It gets up to 60% for those with a score of 4 or more. And the same pattern is seen for women, or for men in the blue bars. We estimate that half of depression has its origins in adverse childhood experiences. Now, that may seem dark. To me, I get excited as a public health and prevention person. That means it's highly preventable. As we're successful in the fields we're working at reducing stress in families, we can really cut down the percentage of people who are depressed in our culture. If you look at something like intravenous drug abuse, taking a needle and syringe and shooting up, people who are not exposed to stress during childhood almost never do that. They almost never do that. We estimate that 80% of intravenous drug use has its origins in ACEs. So intravenous drug abuse is highly preventable as well. Attempted suicide. Attempted suicide. This is the strongest relationship we saw to all of the types of adversity. We see 20 to 40-fold increases in the risk of suicide attempts as you go from the lowest ACE exposures to the highest. Suicide is highly preventable. It's one, drug abuse and suicide attempts and mental illness and interpersonal violence are some of the most highly preventable things that we have in our culture, and we're just learning to use this kind of information in the community to try to reduce that by dealing with adversity. Okay, this is called the KISS. It's a beautiful sculpture. And I'm just going to take you a minute. I've been looking at this information for more than 20 years, and sometimes it still baffles me how this happens. Sometimes I still don't want to believe it. So I like to remain hopeful. I like to remain hopeful and see the beauty in things. And I've started to read about philosophy and theology, which I was not trained in any of that. But we've looked at the biology of adversity, the biologic nature of adversity in human beings. What about our human nature? I believe this. I'm talking about my beliefs. This is not research. This is what I believe. Okay? We have theologians and philosophers say we have a human nature, and that we're embodied here for a purpose. Why are we here? And they tell us that we're built for something. As human beings, what are we built for? The most common thing I hear is reproduction. I'm like, well, no, that's not real. That's close, but no, that's not. We do that, but that's not what we're built. We're built for love. We come here to love one another. And what happens? Remember that picture at that dinner table with the child and the parents. What is that child getting? Now, those parents, I think parents who transmit adversity to the kids doesn't mean they don't love them, but the nature of it, I think, gets a little twisted. And I think if we don't get loved at all, or we get loved in ways that are sort of twisted, that it hurts our nature. The second thing that I learned is that they talk about us having minds. We're built for love, and we have a mind. And I would like to think, I believe that my mind is something more than the sum total of the functioning of all the neurons in my brain. I don't really like that idea. I think there's something more to my consciousness than that. They say we have minds. And what are our minds for? I know nobody studied philosophy and theology here, right? Okay. They say our minds are built to seek the the truth. You know, when you see truth, what is it like to see truth in your life? Isn't that wonderful? A wonderful thing? What do children get in these chaotic, stressful environments? Are they getting the truth they need so that they can have healthy minds? Not just healthy brains, but healthy minds. So I submit to you that we need to think about not only the biology and not get so reductionistic that we forget about things like truth and love and keeping hope. And there's a biology of all those things, keeping those and injecting those into our culture. The intergenerational cycle of violence. Let's look at the far left. This is the risk of growing up and having an intimate partner. This is women on the left. An intimate partner who's physically violent and abuses her. Physically abusive partner goes up from 3% to almost 15%, and we see the same pattern for men, although they're less frequently abused by their intimate partners. So intimate partner violence, which is one of the ACEs, right, domestic violence, gets transmitted up to the next generation, and then when those people are raising kids, they tend to inadvertently expose their kids to the behaviors that go along with the adversity. ACEs are a pathway to disease. What's the leading cause of death in the United States for both men and women? It's up there, right? Heart disease. When you get to ACE scores of 3 or 4, you see a doubling of the risk of heart disease. A doubling of the risk of the leading cause of death in our country. And I want to tell you that we actually don't know how this works. We know a lot about it. I was a cardiovascular disease researcher. I'm an internist. I learned a lot about heart disease. The way that adversity leads to heart disease is largely unknown yet at this point. Only about 1/3 of that risk of increased heart disease goes through the things that we know of that are the risk factors for heart disease. And it's probably some of this biology we're uncovering now about the way the brain works and probably the way our genes get turned on and off that put us at risk for heart disease if we grow up with a lot of stress. Okay, so here is a progression. Let's go back to remember the ACE pyramid model. We start early and one thing leads to another. On the far left here is the percentage of people who became regular everyday cigarette smokers by age 12. Not experimental, but the risk of becoming a regular daily smoker by age 12 goes up in a dose-response pattern on the far left. In the center is the percentage of people who were cigarette smokers by mid-age. And you see that go up in dose response. And we all know this. What happens when you start smoking cigarettes early and you smoke them for decades? What are you at risk for? Lung disease, right? So on the far right is the risk of chronic bronchitis or emphysema. Okay, so now we're going to move. Let's go back to this idea that's really important that we can take out to the world that brings compassion to people that have experienced stress and violence and adversity and the way they respond to it because we adapt to our environments. And I'm going to use smoking as an example of that. Those 12-year-old kids that are smoking every day. Let's take a group of low ACE kids and a group of high ACE kids. Why do the high ACE kids, when they take that first cigarette, take a puff, why don't they do it again? Why are they more likely to do that again and again and again than the ones that haven't had a lot of stress and adversity in their lives? Because adversity tends to generate in our brain emotional responses that generate anxiety and depression and difficulty concentrating. They're more likely to have those things, experiencing those things. And when they get that first cigarette, they get a treatment. And that treatment is called nicotine. Nicotine is a really powerful neurotransmitter that many decades ago was being looked into as being used as an antidepressant medication. Now, it has too many side effects for that. It's not used that way. So what are those kids doing? They're adapting. Smoking is a functional behavior for people that have a lot of anxiety and depression and difficulty concentrating. So a lot of these behaviors are functional behaviors, like, using a drug or using alcohol and getting relief. And then repeating it again, I believe, is the pathway into addiction. It's not the substance. It's the interaction of the substance or the behavior with the person's experience that leads to an adaptive response that makes things better for them. Now, they know there are negative consequences to those adaptations, but this is part of being trauma-informed, is understanding that people adapt to the way they experience things and will do things to try to make things better in their lives. So probably all of you, how many here are trauma-informed people, consider themselves trauma-informed? Okay, so I'm glad I have this slide. This is the essence of a revolution in our country. We are undergoing a revolution of the way we look at people with health and social problems by asking people not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. Not what's wrong, what happened. If we understand people's stories, we understand the behaviors and issues they have in their lives, and we can be compassionate with them, and they can be compassionate with themselves. I showed you my son. I had to bring my daughter along. This is my daughter, Kelsey. She has seen me present this a few times, and she said, Dad, you really do kind of a crummy job of talking about being trauma-informed. Dad, you can do that better. So she actually sat down with me in my study and said, let's come up. This is mostly her stuff, about her ideas of taking this idea of being trauma-informed to the next level. By understanding our story of adversity, and you have this in your little notebooks. It's called Finding Your ACE Score. That's how people get their stories of their life adversity during childhood. Having that story, which I've learned people don't assemble on their own. They need help assembling their story. It provides a chance for them to see the story of their life and to create a different path for the future. And it changes the story from shame and confusion and the adaptations that have a downside. I think one of the first things that being trauma-informed does, it reduces shame. I think people's stories of their lives when they've had a lot of adversity is essentially inaccurate or wrong, because they blame themselves for their childhood experiences over which they have no control. And now there are things in their lives that don't seem to be working right and aren't meeting societal expectations, and there's shame and confusion in that. And what this information does is it helps people to reboot and create a new story. Because I think they're stuck. If you imagine you're a book of your own story, there's a tendency for people who have these kind of health and social problems that come from adversity to see that as the chapter. And then the next chapter is like the prayer one. And it gives them a chance to see their lives and reduce the shame and confusion. And I think it gives them hope. And it gives them meaning and purpose. And the greatest meaning and purpose that I think helps people to heal and feel better is what I hear them say is, why didn't somebody tell me this 25 years ago? Now what I can do, now I'm empowered by my story. I experience these things, I know how this works, and I'm going to make it my meaning and purpose to reduce the transmission of my adversity to my children and to help other people do the same thing. And that's why I think the biggest wheel in self-healing communities are the people that have experienced adversity. Okay? And I know a lot of us here have, but I think the most important thing we can do is to teach everyone what we're learning about today and to have a trauma-informed country. So let's go into some of the systems. Let's just talk a little bit about a couple of I believe the most important systems and what this means from a system sense. In the education system, the costs of the status quo are the costs of walking away and saying, this is too big, it's overwhelming, I don't know what to do next, I don't have a book with a protocol in it, so I'm not going to do anything. So in the education system, This is from Spokane, Washington, where this information has been embedded in the community repeatedly over 10 years. A researcher, Dr. Chris Blodgett at the university there, because this was an ACE-informed, trauma-informed community, he was able to approach the school system and say, I want to find out how much adversity there is in the classrooms in Spokane. That would be really hard to do someplace because this is kind of threatening, but that was a trauma-informed community. So he was able to go in and through the teachers and other people that knew the students by proxy, get their ACE scores. He didn't ask the kids directly. And he found that students with 3 or more ACEs are 2.5 times more likely to fail a grade. They score lower on standardized tests. They have language difficulties. They get suspended or expelled more. They're designated special education more frequently. And as you would expect, they get sick more often. Now here's another example of how this was applied in the state of Washington. This is a classroom with students at their desks, 30 students. And I don't know if you can see the numbers on the desks, but those would be in a representative high school classroom, the ACE scores of 30 students. And as we know, the students don't come with the ACE scores on their desks. So this is what it would look like. There would be 6 in that first row with 0 ACEs, 5 with 1 as we're going through the different colors, shades, 6 with 2 ACEs, 3 with 3, 4 with 4, and when we get to the bottom row, there would be 3 students with 6 or more ACEs in a classroom. 6 or more. So the majority of students have a lot of ACEs in a representative classroom. And this would not be different from state to state or classroom to classroom or from age group to age group. Although as kids get older, the ACEs tend to pile up. So this is what it would look like in high school. Our school's built to deal with the adaptations that these kids have to their adversity. What are they more likely to do? More likely to use alcohol and drugs. They're more likely to be hyper-responsive and hyper-vigilant and have difficulty responding or focusing in the classroom. And now there is a movement to develop trauma-informed schools. I know there's a lot on the internet about this now. I think there are probably schools here in California that are taking this information and trying to adapt the classroom and the school systems to meet the needs of the kids, rather than kids who have these adaptations that don't meet the expectations of the school. It's a really powerful difference. The prison pipeline. The prison pipeline. Here is an application in Pierce County, Washington, a woman that I knew who fortunately died of ovarian cancer a few years ago, worked with the kids in the juvenile justice system. She loved those kids. And she came to me and she said, can we get ACEs on the kids that I work with in the juvenile justice system? And we used their data system to come up with something that's very much like the ACE score we used in the ACE study. And that score is across the bottom from left to right, from 0 to 5 or more. The height of the gray bars, as the dose of stress goes up in these kids' life in childhood, the height of those bars is a history of 7 or more suspensions or expulsions. 7 or more suspensions or expulsions since the first grade in those kids. So if we think about life course pathways that are in the juvenile justice system and they get suspended or expelled from school, where do they go? Where do they go? There's adversity and stress in their neighborhoods and in their families. And then the one place where they can go, and I'm not criticizing anybody here, okay, we're raising awareness. The one place where they can go has policies that says, we don't want you here. We don't like the way you behave. We don't understand that you have adapted and that we can do things to adapt our school so that you can stay in school and be successful. So where do they go? This is the risk in those same kids of a felony reoffense. The blue bars are the first year post-probation and the green bars are within 2 years. So if you look at the green bars on the far right, you see this familiar pattern of dose response. 31% of those kids with ACE scores of 5 or more had a felony reoffense 2 years post-probation. And so what's happening now, and these are some examples of how this information is becoming embedded in communities and systems so that people begin to change the way they think about their policies and practices. And I think especially important, and this is new for me, I believe that the most important public health system in our country is our education system. If you had asked me that 20 years ago, I would have said you're crazy. Our education system, and then the justice system, and then these other systems that are in the self-healing communities. So who are these kids in the juvenile justice system, and what are their characteristics? Large numbers of them experience mental health disorders. See the big numbers in yellow from 4 different studies around the country is the percentage of those kids in different juvenile justice systems that have a diagnosable mental health disorder. It's about 70% everywhere it's been studied. 70%. What did I tell you where we saw the slide on depression? Okay. 60 to 80% of mental health disorders have their origins in adverse childhood experiences. Can you go back one? Good. Okay. In this pie chart, so we have those kids, and the big part of this blue pie chart, 72% of those kids with mental health disorders have a co-occurring substance abuse disorder. So you do the simple math and multiply those together, half of the kids in the juvenile justice system have both, a mental health disorder and a substance abuse disorder. And we're incarcerating them. Our country is incarcerating more people per capita than any country in the history of mankind. So the solution is a solution, and I'm not being negative. We build more prisons. We've got a big pipeline generating a lot of adversity, and the adaptations to stress is a solution to build more prisons, or is a solution to get this information to the systems that feed the pipeline and that are in the pipeline so that we do things differently and get these kids into treatment. If they're not dangerous to other people, why are we incarcerating them? They need to be treated, and they need trauma-informed care, compassionate care. So let's walk through the progressive nature of adversity and begin to sum this up. On the far left, we have adverse childhood experiences that lead to predictable patterns of brain development, traits, and behaviors. The way our nerve cells learn from what comes in, how adaptive we are. And here are some examples of what happens when there's a lot of adversity. There is slowed language and reading. There's something called lateralization, which is using the left side of your brain more than the right or vice versa, the integration of brain functions. A tendency for scoring lower on IQ tests, poor decision-making skills, memory problems, attention problems, difficulty paying attention, ADD or ADHD, and I'm going to stop here for a minute. I'm hearing more and more from people, pediatricians and other people working with kids about the concern. Remember that classroom where the majority of kids have adversity? A lot of those kids will have attention problems and seem hyperactive because they're scared. You know, what's going to happen next? It looks like ADD, ADHD. And so there are a lot of kids we're learning now who are being treated as though they have those disorders, who really have the childhood version of PTSD. And so we need to be able to get this information out there so that we don't treat them for something they don't have, which actually the treatment may make it worse. They have aggressive behavior, social isolation among peers, poor understanding of social cues leading to conflict. And then there's the early use or abuse of alcohol, tobacco, illicit or prescription drugs, teen pregnancies, sexual behaviors. A lot of the things that we think about as adolescent health issues are more common. And then they're more likely to be assigned to special education, alternative schools. They're likely to fail, get failing grades or drop out. They get suspended or expelled much more commonly than the other students. Delinquency, and then a tendency to move into the prison pipeline. And now we're into adulthood. Okay? We've moved into adulthood. And what, if you go through this pathway and the progression is not halted and you don't have people working with you in families and systems and all the ways that people interact with society, tend to end up in low-wage jobs, to be unemployed or on public assistance, to be incarcerated in jail or in prison, have multiple chronic health problems, mental health and substance abuse problems, and have more difficulty with parenting and relationships between people, which is something that we can do to help so that we stop the cycle. We stop the cycle. If we didn't know what this was, and I showed you this data without telling you what the exposure was, and I told you it was a virus, you would believe me. I forgot about the first time I presented this. I did this in New York at New York University. I presented it as an unknown, and people were saying, "Well, it's poverty," or "No, it's an infectious disease." And then I told them what it was. So these were academics guessing. I didn't tell them what the exposure was, but I showed the scores. And some of them thought it was an infectious disease. What's the power of the ACE study? Why is it powerful? And I'm going to stop here for a second. I believe what we are generating, we have the capacity to generate a social movement or a revolution. And people that have talked to me that have studied the kind of social movements and social change and revolutions tell me there are two important things that are essential ingredients. The first is a common language. Using the same language so that everybody knows the same language. It turns out we got lucky calling this the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, because people will come away from this presentation and talk about ACEs. And they'll talk about ACE scores. And I think one of the reasons that it works is it's a simple term. We just got lucky, okay, calling it the ACE study. People will talk about this, and they'll talk to each other about their scores. And one of the reasons they'll do that is because they feel safe doing it. Because if you talk about your score, you don't have to reveal what you experienced, which may be difficult to talk about. But you can talk about your score. So we have a common language and a common conceptual framework. Something that everybody understands. You can say, here's what it is, and we're all talking about the same thing, and we know what it means. And that framework we've been through today. ACEs are common. They're highly interrelated. They tend to pile up and have a cumulative impact on the risk of a wide variety of health and social problems. And they account for, and this is really where you can get to policymakers and legislators, a high percentage, 50, 60, 70, 80% of some of the most troublesome health problems in our country have their origins in adversity. And we now have, we're learning about the biology of it, which helps people to accept that this is fact. Those people who don't want to believe this get convinced by the biology. So self-healing communities. Self-healing communities. I told you at the beginning that you might think I'm a utopian fool talking about self-healing communities. And I travel the country a lot, and I teach, and I do trainings, and I'm seeing in multiple states around the country that I've visited many times the emergence of communities that are doing this. And I have a video that I'm going to show here to end that I believe is proof that there is such a thing as a self-healing community. The background on this video, about 8 years ago, I was in Walla Walla, Washington, and I was in a community center. It wasn't a convention or a meeting of researchers. It was people in a community. It was a community center. And I did a presentation much like this one, because I believe that everybody can understand this information. Just about everybody can understand it. At the end of the presentation, a woman marched up to the front and yanked the microphone out of my hand and started talking. And I got so anxious and disturbed that I couldn't hear what she was talking about. I'd never had anybody do that before during a presentation. 2 or 3 years later, I was in Canada at a national meeting, and a woman who worked in Washington and had worked in Walla Walla came up to me and said, "Do you remember Annette?" I go, "No, who's Annette?" "Well, she's the woman that grabbed the microphone from you in Walla Walla." "Oh, I remember Annette. Okay? I remember her." And they have a video of her. And one thing I want to tell you, in this video, she talks about the ACEs test. That's the finding your ACE score, the one-page thing you have in your booklet. I handed that out during the meeting. I sometimes do that as a teaching tool so people can get their own ACE score and start to generate their narrative so they can heal. She had done that. So if we can play the video, this is Annette.
I was invited to the conference or the meeting out at the college, and I came not really knowing and not really understanding the whole thing, but I wanted my sister came along with me also, and he started going through all the questions and about your childhood and how it affected the way you are today and things like that. And my sister and I both sat there and we filled out the paper, and it said to take the ACEs test and stuff. And we could say yes. You say yes or no to the questions, and we could say yes to all 10 of the questions. And I thought, I can't, I'm tired of, my life is just going nowhere or anything, and I'm tired of just being nobody. I have to do something about it, and something happened. And I just was like, I woke up and realized that nobody's going to change you and nobody's going to do anything for you. You have to be willing to change and do something for yourself. I've had so much negative in my life and not hardly any positive. And so I went through the motions, with my kids and trying to parent them the best I knew. I went through the motions of going to the school meetings and showing up and another one, and over and over and over. But now it's more of, I'm in the middle of it, I'm involved, I'm a part of, and they're listening to me. They know, when I want something for my son, they know where it's coming from. The saying, it takes a village to raise a child, that's my favorite saying in the world, because my village came together. After the ACEs presentation was when it was like a wake-up call to me. It was time for me my life was not going anywhere. It's time for me to wake up and stop being the victim and start being a role model, start being a human. I feel like I can live now. I'm out of my shell. I don't have to hide. I don't have to be the victim. If I'm going to help my son, I have to help myself first. You have to want to wake up. You have to want to change. And I wanted more for my children than what I had.
To me, that's a miracle. That's a miracle. And I believe that as we teach this, what's the biggest wheel in a self-healing community? What are the things that Annette said? I've watched this so many times, I'm not going to ask you to. What did she say? I'm tired. I want to be human. How much shame is that? I want to be human. And she said, something happened. She said, I was at the meeting, something happened. And I believe what happened is she became trauma-informed. And she saw the story of her life in the story of the ACE study and all the thousands of people in it and all these other studies. She saw herself in it, and she got a picture of her life. And she had a chance to change the narrative. I think her shame and confusion were reduced. And she said, you have to want to wake up. I think that happened for her in that moment. I don't have to do this anymore. I get it. And then what did she do? We've been talking about the intergenerational cycle. What did she do? She had 2 sons. When she came to that meeting, she was living out of her car, homeless with her 2 sons. And so she started changing the way she interacted with her sons. She became an advisor to the school system on adversity and homelessness. And now she has her own little foundation in Walla Walla, Washington, to help homeless people get their feet on the ground. So the greatest power for change, I believe, comes from believing that people who've been affected by adversity, if they're taught this information, can become part of a social movement. They can heal themselves in the context of a community that understands this. Because she had people assist her with getting from where she was to having a foundation. She had assistance because she was in a trauma-informed community. And the other thing that I'm going to say is part of the miracle is what I call the miracle of identification. She saw this information, she saw her story, and I think part of it is I'm not alone. I'm not the only one. There's lots of people like me. And there's something transformative about that miracle of identification. So I believe that this is the most important public health information ever. And it's not because I did this study. I tell you, we were not smart. We didn't know what we were going to find. We stumbled into this and went, oh my gosh, look at this information. I believe that every person has the right to know this information. And that there are those who will tell you, you can't talk to this about people because you're going to scare them. And they'll be overwhelmed and triggered and have a negative response. I don't believe that. I believe every person has the right to know this information, and I hope you will take it out, not only to the places where you work, but also if you look at those gear systems. I'm going to challenge you. When you go back from this meeting, I want you to think of some system that you don't work in, whether it's a person or a leader or somebody. You call them up and tell them, do you know about these concepts, these basic concepts? So that those gears can begin to work together and create synergy. I want to thank you for having me here, and I want to thank you for the really difficult work that you do and your love and interest for children and families. Thank you very much.
All right, we have some time for a few questions, and then Dr. Anto has to leave, so make it quick. Sorry.
Hi, Dr. Anto. My mother-in-law works with women in prison, and she's working on family reunification. I'm just wondering how I can relay that information about ACE and what practical application she can implement in helping these women who are serving time work towards reunification, and some of them are going to be in there for life, but what ways can they help to learn about themselves and build a relationship with their children in a healthy way?
Great. Thank you. That's really important. And one of the other things that I believe is important is when we talk about why we're incarcerating people, there are places where, especially women with children or pregnant women, give them an ankle bracelet and let them serve whatever they need to serve at home so they can be with their child and attach and be there for their child. If they're not dangerous, let them be with their child. And so that's happening. There's drug courts and alternative sentencing and a lot of things that can help shift the kind of things so that those women or the men who have children can be with their families and attach with their children and teach them and bond. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Anda. Thank you so much for your presentation. I probably have read all of your ACEs study papers.
Boy, you are really diligent because some of that's really boring.
Yeah, because myself, personally, I also did a ACEs study for, the early childhood, and I found that ACEs actually was, statistically related with young children's, behavior problems.
Mm-hmm.
And also the dose response effect is also, valid, for the behavior problems. But not for the developmental delays. I found, ACEs is related with the, developmental delays like motor skills, language development, but the dose response just, does not work there.
You did not see dose response?
No,
Okay.
but because the children, they are too young, probably like,
Yes.
5 years old, so
Yes.
maybe, come up
Yes.
later. So today my question is, I want to ask you the timing of ACEs. So do you think, the earlier ACEs or the latest ACEs, which one can be more, severe for, children, people's health problems, all these problems?
Yes.
Thank you. The
Yes, yes,
timing.
that's a wonderful question. Yes, that we're asking. We know that the brain develops from the lower portion, what we call the more primitive functions, to the middle, to the top, and also kind of like inside out, if you can imagine it three-dimensionally. So when the stressors occur, if they're occurring during a critical period of development for language, or a critical for attachment, for what a relationship's like, or for conceptual framing to be able to read or write or do math, the timing probably does make a difference, right? As to when it occurs, as to whatever part of the brain is wiring up the fastest at that point is more vulnerable to the stress of the cortisol and the adrenaline. And the other thing that we need to remember that you might want to think about is what happens. One thing that happens is that when there's early adversity, that can get embedded in the way the brain functions. But the manifestations of that alteration in function may not become evident until those children grow up and get older. And Dr. Marty Teicher, who's one of the leading neuroscientists in this field, found that for kids that have early adversity, they can look pretty good, okay, some of them, and not have behavioral problems or mental health or substance abuse problems. But when they hit adolescence, there's this 5 or 6 year latent period between the time that the adversity occurs and when the kind of things manifest. Because once the brain hits that level of functioning, those things can't manifest. Does that make sense? So there can be a latent period between the exposure and the outcome during childhood and adolescence.
Hi, Dr. Anda, thank you for your presentation this morning.
Oh.
Over here. So the ACE test, the 10 risk factors in here, are all about the child-family relationship. I've seen papers and also groups talking about ACEs and really broadening that definition, most commonly to neighborhood things like
Yes.
bullying, neighborhood violence, or even racism. And I wonder if you looked at any of those neighborhood things and what your thoughts are about how predictive they are, or health outcomes. Would you treat them differently, or just?
Yes, that what you're asking about is just beginning. There's a study called the Philadelphia Urban ACE study, which is the first one I know of, that took what we did in this ACE study and looked at community factors. They looked at things like witnessing violence outside the home, racism, being bullied, not feeling safe going to school or going shopping. There was a few, about 5 or 6 important factors, and they looked at those. The most common one was seeing violence outside of the home. And so they found that if you take those urban community factors, and not necessarily urban, but community factors, that 80% of people in Philadelphia in the community studied had either the traditional ACEs or the community level ACEs. If you look at just the ACEs that we did, it was 60%. And now what they're doing is they don't have the data yet, is when you take those together, does it pile up even more and generate even more risk? Are things, ACE-related problems, not only more common, but does the risk go up as a result of those combined experiences?
First off, I just want to say thank you for taking what appeared to be a depressing topic and turning it into a message of hope, because I truly feel that. As I looked at the different adverse experiences, I look at my own family. I've been through several of those, my family, myself. And I see the difference between me and my siblings as far as our outcomes. So I'm just wondering, as a side kind of benefit of doing this over the years, what have you learned about resiliency?
Mm-hmm.
You know, the differences in one child versus another who go through the same experiences.
Yes. Resiliency, conceptually, can be divided into three components of sorts. There are the characteristics of the person. Okay? So some people probably have a greater biologic response to stress. They may generate more adrenaline and cortisol than another. There are some of the inherent things that people have, like their innate intelligence. There are individual factors that can relate to the kind of differences that you talk about. Then the second domain is relational context. So if people have relationships that are protective, like with a grandparent or a neighbor or a coach, that the ability of and that's why there's like mentoring programs and trying to get people exposed that have adversity outcomes in relationship with a functional adult. A functional adult who's not hyper-aroused, to help them learn to calm themselves down and to know what healthy attachment looks like. So there's the relationships, and then there's community factors, the community level factors. How healthy is the community? Is there violence? That includes are there trauma-informed schools, trauma-informed justice systems, trauma-informed healthcare providers, and that also within that there is a component of spirituality. Now, spiritual health, and is it spiritually a healthy community? So there are no. Let me pull back, and it's important to know that an ACE score is not destiny. Right? You can have a lot of ACEs and have none of these outcomes. And so what I've shown you today is the public health way of looking at when we take groups of people with ACEs, what the risk is. Within those groups, there are people who have none of those outcomes. And so those resilience or protective factors can have a lot to do with the trajectory, the life course trajectory when exposed to trauma and stress.
Good morning, Dr. Anda. My name is Lesford Duncan. I work
If
as
you could talk a little louder.
My apologies.
Thank you.
My name is Lesford Duncan. I work as a child abuse prevention coordinator here with the County of San Bernardino Children's Network. And we are so grateful for your study, for the tool that you've given us to really spread this information out to not only professionals, but also to our communities, to our parents, through our schools. My question is, are you doing any work, or are there other health and behavioral health outcomes that you're exploring? And also, are you looking at also comparing levels of trauma and types of trauma to those behavioral and health outcomes later on in life?
Yeah, that's a great question. The next level of work in this field is going to refine what we stumbled into and generated in the 1990s and through the early 2000s of what's the intensity of the trauma or the types of trauma, how does that relate to outcomes. In terms of other behavioral outcomes, I'm not sure which ones you might be referring to. It might be important for you to teach me what we need to look at more. But what I'm increasingly dedicating my time to is going out and training, going to communities with a colleague of mine from the state of Washington, which is the state that's led the nation in having trauma-informed communities. The two examples I gave you, Walla Walla and the justice system, were not an accident. They spent 10 years doing community education. We've put together a Train the Trainer program so that we train a group of people to present this information with fidelity, and then they go out to the public or they target the service systems and do trainings. And then after they get good at it, they train another person to do it. And in the state of Minnesota, there are now 70 people who can do a presentation with quality, much like the one, if you think what I did had any quality to it, with quality throughout the whole state. And they've stopped counting the number of people that have reached. Tens of thousands of people in the state of Minnesota have now this information embedded in their communities. And I believe this in the grassroots level of this. And what's happened is that's moved up to the point where people are starting to call their legislators. And this is part of what I believe is the social revolution, that we're creating a market force for change that begins with the general public and then targeting the service sectors. Their legislature just now passed a resolution to put ACE education into all of the service systems throughout the state. Now, we'll wait and see if that happens. But that was a result of people, the average person calling them and saying, what are you doing about this? This is in my community, it's affected me or my family. What are you going to do about it? So, I don't know if I answered your question, but. We'll have to use Mike. Sorry.
Just as a follow-up, what are some of the policy outcomes that you expect out of this growing movement?
Yeah, the kind of policy outcomes are, I've seen states are beginning to mandate that health providers of all sorts get training in ACEs, and that they need to incorporate into their history taking, whatever kind of provide that ticket in their history taking. I'm seeing that. I'm seeing policy changes to say that we need to get this into the education system and develop trauma-informed schools. There are local. What's interesting is I think the policy changes that are really potent are the ones that emerge from the grassroots. That in communities, they're changing their own policy so they don't have to go through the hierarchy where change happens rapidly. So changes in disciplinary practices in schools, changes in the way judges and prosecutors and people in the court adjudicate and get people into treatment versus incarceration. Those alternatives are happening, and this is why I believe in the grassroots thing. When those are successful, other people listen, and then it can go up to the higher level policymakers at the state and national level.
We have time for one last question. This is it.
Oh, geez, pressure. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for coming and speaking. The reason why I really wanted to be here was because I wanted to hear you speak. So thank you. How have you guys been able to look at how the ACEs affects homelessness?
Yeah. Yes. I have a PowerPoint deck that you would probably, by the end of the day, you would just be crumpled in your chair. There's so many graphs that I could show you. I didn't show it, but homelessness. It is the most powerful generator of homelessness of anything that I've ever seen. In the absence, just like with drug abuse and mental illness, in the absence of these kind of adversities, the chances of ever being homeless are really tiny. And when you get to high levels of ACE, people are 25 times more likely to end up being homeless. And you imagine what's the pathway? Right? School performance, difficulty with relationships, mental health and substance abuse disorders, difficulty concentrating if you have a job, difficulty doing it, getting engaged in the justice system, and you imagine the pathway to eventually, one thing goes wrong and you're homeless.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right. That's it. I want to say thank you, Dr. Anda, for this information, for being here.